Yo, what's up guys, Lord Seno here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about game balance. I'm going to be talking about game balance in very general terms, and this is mainly as someone who's played League of Legends for like 7 to 8 years. After reading the patch notes for so long, I've gotten a good idea of how optimal game balancing should work and how it shouldn't work, and so for Deepwoken, a lot of the terms that I'm about to use are very similar, and the same problems that can come up with game balancing can come up in even a Roblox game like Deepwoken. The background footage is from Fakewoken 3, which is Monkey Mode's game. That'll be in the description if you want to check it out. It's a pretty funny parody. So the first term that I want to talk about is power creep. Power creep is something that a lot of players are just unaware of, and it's something that I feel like if people were in charge of balancing, they would succumb to this really easily. So power creep in general terms is when the average power of certain items or builds increases over time in a game. Power creep is generally a really bad thing because it can make it so that some of the old stuff that's in the game is redundant. Here I'll give you a specific example of how power creep can affect a game like Deepwoken and why it would be bad for the game. Before some of the nerfs and bug fixes, Ice Eruption used to do one of the highest damage out of any mantras in the game. Here is a clip of Infinasu taking 60% of his HP from Ice Eruption at level 55. So at the time when Ice Eruption used to do that much damage, no other move actually did anywhere near that much damage. So a lot of people were complaining about the move and they wanted it to be nerfed, but some Frostro users said, why do you need to nerf Ice Eruption? Why don't you make the other mantras that everyone else has do more damage when they all do 60% of your HP? If every move does that much damage, then no move is overpowered, right? Well, you're technically correct in that it's not unbalanced. All of the moves have the same damage and therefore they're not overpowered in relation to one another. But then the state of the game completely changes. Now it changes from a M1 based meta to a meta where you can literally hit someone with 2 ranged moves and they're dead. This would effectively remove M1ing from the game. No one would want to do that when you could just hold S, run away, and wait for your Ice Eruption to come off cooldown. Why would you M1 someone for 5% of their HP when it's really easy to parry? When you can use a range move which does 60% of someone's HP. They may parry it, sure, but eventually you're going to be able to hit them if you keep on using it. By buffing the other mantras, you are encouraging this playstyle, and you make people hold S and actually just run and spam mantras, because there's no other way to play the game. If you want to play like an M1 champion, like Infinasu, then you're going to be bad at the game, because that's not how the meta is. If you try and do that, then you'll just be like having to play against people who run away and then use Ice Eruption. This is an example of power creep at the most extreme. By making some things OP, you are basically removing other things from existence in the game. So how did the devs actually solve this problem? They simply reduced the damage of Ice Eruption. And you know what? Ice Eruption is still one of the best moves in the game. It's a pretty reliable damaging move, but it's not that ridiculous anymore. It doesn't do 60% of your HP. I hope you can understand the reasoning as to why in this situation, nerfing something is a much better option than actually buffing everything else. In my nerf Flame Charm video, a lot of people suggested that we should focus on buffing all the other mantras and elements, and it's not a horrible idea. Like, I get the logic that you want other things to be viable as well, but still enjoy your own magic. But the problem with that is that if every magic had AoE the size of Fire Eruption, and they had moves which had as short a wind-up as Ash Slam, then we would get a meta where M1ing isn't viable. Everyone would just be spamming magic, and they would use Ring of Casters. No one would even want to M1 anymore. If every magic had 4 legendary talents, then people would start going dual magics and they would stop investing into actual other stat points. Here I can hope you understand why buffing everything to an extreme is a bad idea, because it ruins build variety in the game. This is one of the most damaging things about power creep, and it's why developers need to be really careful when adding new talents, because if they're too strong, then they can actually just ruin build diversity in other parts of the game. On the other hand though, if these talents are balanced and they're actually not too overpowered, then it can be a strong option for players to use and another alternative for them to actually increase build diversity in the game. Power creep is the reason why we end up with stereotypes such as Heavy Wind and Azure Flame, Royal Pathfinder, Shattered Katana. It's because some of these options are so strong that players find it so unrewarding to actually go for anything else. Like personally, I find Thundercall really fun, but I can't use it and actually be competitive, because the only spell that makes it viable is Lightning Cloak, and Lightning Cloak requires an insane amount of RNG to get. I have 4 level 60 lightning accounts and I haven't got lightning cloak once. Alternatively, I could just pick up flame or gale breath and get the OP mantras and modify them, and I'm set. And it's the fact that that's so easy to do that makes it so that creative builds are just not as rewarding. I'll give you an example of how the developers are effectively solving power creep with their new content updates. As I'm sure you're aware, I'm very critical of the talent and mantra balancing, but as far as weapon balancing, I'm very impressed with how the developers have done, and they've solved this problem effectively. Before the update, the 3 viable medium weapons, the S tier ones, were Shadow Katana, Rifle Spear, and Curved Blade of the Winds. There were some that were like borderline viable, like Serpent's Edge, and you could use them if you had a reason to use them, like an enchant or something like that. But generally speaking, most medium weapon players chose between these 3 weapons. Now, when adding new weapons to the game, the developers had certain options. They could make something more powerful than the current weapons so that players would be incentivized to choose them. They can make them as powerful as the current S tier weapons, or they can make them weaker. Most developers would choose to make the new weapons stronger than the ones that are currently in the game, so for example a better Shadow Katana or a better Rifle Spear. But in the case of Deepwoken, if they did do this would be very short-sighted balancing. The reason why is because it would make it so that Shadow Katana and Rifle Spear would be redundant. You're effectively removing 2 weapons from the game in exchange for a short influx of players who want to unlock the new weapons. Making weapons incredibly weak and way weaker than the ones that are already meta would make it so that players have no incentive to actually go and grind for them, and this would also be a bad choice. Instead, what Deepwoken did was they actually made it so that some of the weapons were just as good as the old S tier weapons. For example, Sacred Hammer is a perfect example. That's just as good as the Shadow Katana, and it doesn't feel overpowered or you don't feel forced to use it. You could say the same thing about the Greatsword First Light as well. These new weapons are all S tier and they're just as good as the other weapons that are in the game, but you aren't forced to use them. Now you have a choice between 5 medium weapons, pretty much. There's more build diversity in the game, and this is because the developers have effectively solved power creep by making things just as strong as everything else. If the new weapons were OP like the new talents are, then there would be a problem because Shadow Katana, Rifle Spear, those will all be redundant. That is my first lesson on game balancing, and I hope you guys understand a bit more about power creep and why nerfing can be a very effective tool in some situations. I'm not in favor of gutting everything. I think strong things should be nerfed slightly, and then if they're still oppressive to use and play against, then they should be nerfed even more, but you shouldn't make something unviable. That's never been my intention when it comes to philosophy on game balance. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.